President Donald Trump could not hide his surprise when he first heard about Ibrahim Traoré's unusual plan for a healthcare revolution that started not in a modern hospital, but inside the small mud homes of forgotten African villages. Before I take you deeper into this story, make sure you subscribe to this channel because what you are about to discover will challenge everything you know about leadership, power, and compassion. The story begins in a place where pain was louder than hope. Families in rural Burkina Faso were losing their loved ones to illnesses that could have been treated with the simplest care. Mothers carried their sick children for hours under the burning sun, only to reach empty clinics where no doctors waited. It was a world where healthcare seemed like a privilege for the rich, while the poor were left to fight death alone. But then a soldier-turned-leader stood up, and with eyes burning with a different kind of fire, he decided to walk a road that no president before him had dared to walk. Ibrahim Traoré was not speaking about billion-dollar hospitals or luxury medical centers. Instead, he imagined something that sounded almost impossible, turning every home into a center of healing. It was a vision so radical that when the news reached the United States, even Donald Trump reportedly said, "How is this man doing what entire nations could not?" The question was not just about medicine. It was about courage. Imagine the scene. A dusty courtyard where children were playing barefoot suddenly turned into a place where mothers were trained to treat fevers, where fathers learned how to clean wounds, and where neighbors watched over one another as guardians of health. Traoré's plan was not about waiting for a doctor to arrive. It was about making every citizen a part of the solution. This simple but shocking idea spread like fire across villages, and soon the whispers of change traveled beyond borders. Yet, behind every story of hope there's resistance. Powerful companies that made millions from selling medicine were not ready to watch their profits shrink. Local politicians who relied on foreign aid did not like the idea of people becoming self-reliant. They called Traoré reckless, even dangerous. But the more they resisted, the more people stood behind him, believing that for the first time in their lives, someone was not just speaking about them but fighting for them. When the first reports of success reached international media, it was no longer just an African experiment. It became a global debate. Could a leader from one of the poorest nations in the world actually teach powerful countries how to care for their people? Could a man with limited resources achieve what billion-dollar systems had failed to deliver? These questions shook the political circles of Washington, Paris, and Brussels. And in the middle of this storm, Donald Trump's amazement became the headline that drew every eye toward Traoré. But what exactly did Traoré do inside those homes that created such a shockwave? That part of the story holds secrets few outsiders have ever seen. Inside those homes, the idea of healthcare looked nothing like the polished halls of modern hospitals. It began with a wooden table, a clay jar filled with clean water, and a booklet written in simple words that even a farmer could understand. Traoré had ordered teams of young volunteers, many of them former soldiers, to spread across villages and teach families the first steps of survival medicine. The people were not just listening, they were practicing. Mothers learned how to mix salt and sugar to save a child from deadly dehydration. Fathers were taught how to identify early signs of malaria before it became fatal. Grandmothers, once ignored by society, became the guardians of herbal knowledge, combining tradition with science in ways that shocked even trained physicians. The quiet success story spread faster than any government announcement. A child who once coughed blood now ran freely after a simple homemade treatment. An old man who had been abandoned to die from an infection was saved because his neighbor learned how to clean a wound properly. Families who once felt powerless now felt like healers in their own right. The effect was more than medical. It was psychological. People were beginning to believe that their survival did not depend on waiting for a system that had already failed them. But with every story of recovery, opposition grew louder. In the capital, wealthy businessmen who owned private clinics started panicking. If villagers no longer needed expensive treatments, then who would pay their fees? Foreign investors began sending warnings, claiming that such unregulated methods were unsafe. International agencies, who had for decades controlled healthcare aid in Africa, quietly questioned Traoré's credibility. Yet the most shocking reaction came from abroad when whispers reached Washington. Reports landed on the desks of American policymakers that a young African leader was building a healthcare model at almost zero cost, with results that rivaled Western systems. It was a revelation that unsettled political conversations. During one private meeting, a senior advisor remarked, "If this model works, it will prove that we wasted billions on a broken system." That statement alone created ripples strong enough to reach the ears of Donald Trump. His reaction was part disbelief, part curiosity. How could a soldier from a small nation build what the wealthiest countries could not? Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the plan was facing its first true test. One evening, in a rain-soaked village, a child collapsed from a severe fever. The nearest hospital was 2 days away, and the storm had destroyed the roads. But the mother remembered the training given by Traoré's volunteers. She boiled clean water, mixed the right balance of herbs and salts, and cooled her child's body as instructed. Hours later, when the storm cleared, the child opened his eyes again. That single moment became a legend retold by villagers. It was as if Traoré had stood in that room himself. These victories inspired hope, but they also carried danger. The more lives were saved at home, the more enemies Traoré unknowingly created. The revolution had begun, but so had the silent war against it. The silent war did not begin with bullets. It began with whispers, carefully planted in newspapers and whispered in government corridors. Suddenly, international headlines questioned if Ibrahim Traoré was experimenting recklessly with the lives of his people. Critics wrote that teaching families to treat illnesses without doctors could cause dangerous mistakes. Foreign health organizations, many of which had failed for decades to provide solutions, suddenly painted themselves as guardians of safety. They warned the world that what was happening in Burkina Faso was not a revolution, but a gamble. But the people living in the villages knew the truth. They had seen their children breathe again, their wounds heal, and their families survive storms that once left them helpless. To them, these rumors were nothing more than lies crafted by those afraid of losing control. Still, the pressure was real. International donors threatened to cut funds. Local politicians who relied on foreign aid began demanding that Traoré stop this experiment. Behind closed doors, there were even talks of removing him from power. Traoré, however, remained unmoved. Standing before a crowd in the capital, he declared, "When a child's life is saved, no corporation, no agency, and no foreign power has a right to call it a mistake." The words electrified his supporters, but they also marked him as a direct threat to the old order. That very night, a convoy carrying medical supplies meant for the villagers was ambushed on a deserted road. Boxes of medicine were stolen, and volunteers were left beaten. The message was clear. Someone powerful was ready to destroy this vision at any cost. News of the attack reached Washington almost as quickly as it spread through Ouagadougou. Some American politicians dismissed it as another African crisis, but others could not ignore the growing possibility that Traoré's healthcare model was proving too successful. Donald Trump, hearing detailed report for the first time, reportedly asked his advisers, "If he is doing this with nothing, why can we not do it with everything?" That single question, half disbelief and half challenge, captured the shock of an entire political circle. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the people refused to bow down to fear. When medicines were stolen, villagers turned again to what they had learned. They created small emergency centers inside their homes, hidden away from corrupt eyes. Neighbors shared supplies, mothers rotated shifts to care for the weakest, and fathers built secret shelters to protect volunteers traveling through dangerous roads. It was no longer just about health. It was about dignity, independence, and survival. Still, Traoré knew that survival alone would not be enough. He needed the world to see what was happening, and he needed proof strong enough to silence every critic. So, he invited a group of independent journalists to witness the revolution with their own eyes. Cameras entered mud homes and filmed mothers saving their children. Microphones captured the voices of elders saying they had never felt this much hope before. The footage would soon reach global screens, sparking debates in universities, boardrooms, and even the White House. But with cameras rolling, the enemies watching from the shadows prepared their next move, a strike that would shake not only Burkina Faso but the entire world's faith in this rising healthcare revolution. The footage released by the journalists spread like wildfire. In classrooms across Europe, professors played the clips to shock students. In American living rooms, families watched in disbelief as children in Burkina Faso were treated inside humble homes with methods that actually worked. Commentators on television could not ignore it any longer. One anchor on a popular network asked live on air, "How is it possible that a man with almost no resources is doing what the wealthiest nations could not achieve?" The question stirred both admiration and anger. In Burkina Faso, the impact of the international coverage was immediate. Crowds filled the streets, chanting Traoré's name. Mothers held their children up high, as if to prove that his vision had given them life. Yet with every cheer, the danger grew sharper. The enemies who had lost money, influence, and control were now desperate. They realized that public opinion had begun to turn, and once the world believed in Traoré's model, their power would collapse. They had already tried silence, they had tried rumors, and they had tried sabotage. Now, they prepared to strike with something far more ruthless. One evening, as a convoy of journalists traveled back from a remote village, their vehicle was ambushed. Shots were fired into the night, and cameras were smashed to the ground. The reporters barely escaped with their lives, but the message was chilling. There were forces willing to spill blood to bury the story. International headlines the next morning read, "Healthcare Revolution Under Fire." While the world debated, ordinary villagers grew even more determined. If they are trying this hard to stop him, one farmer said, "It means we are winning." The storm did not end there. In Washington, advisors presented Trump with two conflicting reports. One warned that Traoré's methods were dangerous and could destabilize international aid programs. The other argued that his model was revolutionary and was studying for America's own failing healthcare system. Trump leaned back, visibly frustrated, and asked, "Are we really saying an African soldier understands healthcare better than all of us?" The room fell silent. It was not just a question. It was a challenge to an entire system that had spent billions without solving the basic problems of affordability and access. Back in Burkina Faso, Traoré faced a personal test. Late at night, he received word that one of his closest volunteers had been killed in another ambush. The loss weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, his advisors saw doubt in his eyes. Could this vision survive when powerful enemies were ready to destroy anyone who carried it forward? But the very next morning, standing in front of hundreds of villagers, he raised his hand and said firmly, "If one of us falls, 100 must rise." The crowd roared, and hope once again burned through the fray. What nobody knew was that the next twist would come not from his enemies, but from a shocking decision inside Washington itself, one that would either crush his dream or turn it into a global movement overnight. The decision from Washington arrived quietly, wrapped not in public speeches but in confidential documents. An internal memo leaked to journalists revealed that American agencies were split into two camps. One group believed Traoré's model threatened decades of investment and control. They argued that if poor nations could build healthcare systems without Western aid, it would end America's influence in Africa. The other group, smaller but louder, argued that Traoré's plan was a blueprint the United States itself had been searching for. For once, they said, a system proved that healthcare could belong to the people, not corporations. The leak exploded across American media. Headlines screamed, "White House divided over African healthcare revolution." For many Americans tired of sky-high medical bills and insurance battles, Traoré became a symbol of what was possible. Ordinary citizens wrote letters to their representatives, asking why the richest country in the world could not provide what a soldier in Burkina Faso had created with almost nothing. Protesters outside hospitals carried signs that read, "Learn from Traoré." For a man thousands of miles away, the influence was spreading into the heart of America. But for Traoré, the new attention brought crushing pressure. Invitations poured in from international organizations demanding explanations. Offers of partnerships arrived, promising billions of dollars, but all with hidden conditions, control, oversight, and eventually dismantling of the home healthcare network. He read each proposal with suspicion, knowing that behind their polished words lay the same hunger for power that had failed his people for decades. One evening, sitting in a dimly lit room with his closest allies, Traoré admitted the weight of the moment. If we accept their money, we lose our independence. If we reject it, they will try to break us. His advisers sat in silence, but his decision was already forming in his heart. He believed that the revolution had to remain pure, even if the cost was dangerous. Meanwhile, his enemies made their boldest move yet. A sudden flood of misinformation spread online, claiming that Traoré's methods were killing more people than they saved. Fake images, edited videos, and fabricated statistics filled social media feeds. International news outlets picked up the chaos, some unknowingly spreading the lies. Within days, His reputation was under attack. The same journalists who had once praised him now questioned if the miracle was nothing more than smoke and mirrors. But amid the noise, a powerful moment unfolded in Washington. During a private meeting, Donald Trump was handed a folder filled with both the fake reports and the authentic footage from the villages. He sat silently, flipping through the images of mothers saving their children. Finally, he raised his head and said, "I want to meet this man." Those 6 words stunned the room. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about a meeting that could ignite either the collapse or the global rise of Traoré's healthcare revolution. And as preparations began for a historic encounter, forces determined to stop it were already planning a blow that could end everything before the 2 men ever stood face to face. The world held its breath as rumors spread that President Donald Trump had requested a direct meeting with Ibrahim Traoré. For the people of Burkina Faso, it felt like recognition, a moment when their struggle was finally seen on the world stage. In Washington, however, the news sent shockwaves through political circles. Some feared that legitimizing Traoré would empower a new model of independence that threatened corporate and diplomatic interests. Others whispered that this meeting could reshape global healthcare forever. Preparations began quietly. Security teams mapped routes, diplomats arranged protocols, and journalists prepared for what they called a conversation that could change history. But while the world looked forward, Traoré's enemies worked in the shadows. Days before the scheduled meeting, explosions rocked a rural clinic where his volunteers were stationed. Homes collapsed, supplies burned, and children screamed as fire consumed everything. The attackers left no trace, only fear. The timing was no accident. It was a message. If Traoré dared to stand on a global stage, the cost would be paid in blood. The tragedy shook him deeply. Standing among the ashes, he held the hand of a crying mother who had lost a child in the fire. For a moment, the burden seemed unbearable. But then the crowd around him began to chant, their voices trembling yet unbroken. "Do not stop. Do not bow." In that sound, Traoré found his strength again. He wiped his tears and whispered, "If they destroy one home, we will build 10. If they burn one dream, we will create 1,000. When the day of the meeting arrived, anticipation was electric. The room in Washington was filled with advisors, cameras, and tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Trump entered first, his face unreadable. Moments later, Traoré walked in, dressed not in a tailored suit but in the same simple uniform he wore in the villages. Their eyes met, and for a long second, silence hung heavy. Then Trump extended his hand. The cameras flashed, and history recorded the moment. The conversation that followed was not polite diplomacy. Trump asked bluntly, "How did you do this with nothing?" Traoré replied with equal bluntness, "Because my people were left with nothing. And when you have nothing, you either surrender or fight. We chose to fight." The room fell silent again, as if everyone understood the weight of those words. By the time the meeting ended, no formal agreement had been signed, no official partnership declared. Yet something far greater had happened. A story once buried in dusty villages had now reached the most powerful office in the world. For millions watching, it was proof that leadership is not measured by wealth or power, but by the courage to put humanity first. But as Traoré left Washington, one truth lingered in the minds of both his allies and his enemies. Revolutions do not end with handshakes. They begin with them. And somewhere, in the shadows, those who had failed to silence him were already planning their next move.